Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Well, it's a great pleasure to have a chance to talk to Robert Hinde, who I've known for 20 or 30 years now, although we're in different disciplines. Robert, tell me where and when you were born.
I was born in 1923 in Norwich, England. My father was a GP who had married a nurse at Guy's Hospital soon after he trained, and I was the youngest of 4 children. So I, like everything else I'm going to tell you, I was very lucky right from the start.
And your mother was?
My mother was Isabella Taylor from a family in Westmoreland, Kirby Lonsdale. Her father had died early, and her mother had brought up, I think it was 6 children, by starting a cake shop in Kirby Lonsdale, and several of the girls had, I think very courageously at that time, fled the nest. One of them went out to Malay as a nurse, my mother went to Guy's, and another one became a school teacher in Mansfield.
I know Kirby Lonsdale well.
Yeah.
I did a study of its history once. It seems particularly appropriate to ask you about parent-child relationships, since much of your most famous work is in that field, in relation to both humans and monkeys. So, not too deeply, but what effects do you think the character of either your mother or your father had on your subsequent life?
My mother was a very loving mother, and I was the youngest child and got a great deal of her attention. And I think my security stems from having had a very good relationship with her. My father was an extremely hard-working, conscientious GP, but he had an intense interest in natural history and also in the ancient history of the Middle East, where he'd served in World War I. And I'm sure that his encouragement of my natural history interests was very important to me.
You mentioned your mother giving you a very loving, supporting background. Some of your early work was particularly about the fact that in monkey colonies, small monkeys are pushed out or encouraged to be independent by their parents. Do you think your interest in that came out at all of your relationship with your mother?
No.
You don't remember your mother trying to push you out of
No,
the nest? Okay, so where did you go to school?
I went to school at Oundrel, a boys' public school. I went at the age of 11, which was too young to go away. I hated it. And I made no real friends at Oundrel. I was labelled very early on as the professor because I wore glasses. That may have had a very interesting effect on me, I don't know.
Were you short-sighted?
No, my father, I think mistakenly, thought I had a squint when I was 2 years old, and they clapped me in glasses to try and correct it. I think it's probably a very antiquated procedure.
Because there have been studies of the effects of myopic children's wearing glasses on their personalities, which fit with your suggestion.
Have there?
Yes.
I won't ask you what it did to them.
Made them studious, yes. They didn't play games because they couldn't see the football.
Oh, well, that's another issue, yes.
Were you any good at games?
No, not really. I was in the second school 15 in the end. It was that level, captain of house football, but I wasn't really very good. I used to play squash quite a lot, or rather fives, I should say, squash when I got up to Cambridge.
You say you didn't really make many friends there, so there were no students. It's a bit odd that you went to Oundle as your first boarding school. You hadn't gone to a preparatory school that was a boarding school.
No, Oundle had a preparatory house, which was called the Berrystead, and I went there at 11 to 14.
I see. Were there any teachers at Oundle who particularly influenced you?
That was the thing I got out of Oundle, and I was entered for Schoolhouse because when they interviewed, or were interviewed, I'm not sure which way around it was, my parents found he had an acquaintance with Kirby Lonsdale, and so they wanted me to go into his house. But I was...
Who is he? What was it?
A man called Kenneth Fisher, who was a very good headmaster, I think. But when I got towards the end of my time in the Berrystead, I was the first boy to go into a school certificate science form called Shell, where the form master was a man called Ian Hepburn, to whom I owe an enormous debt.
That's Hepburn.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And towards the end of my first, I remember, he was also known as Saki, and I remember for our first chemistry prep.
Is that with an R or as in the novelist Saki?
No, with an R. Our first chemistry prep, he told us to write down 5 metals and 5 non-metals, and I wrote down paper, string and coal or something as my non-metals, and I remember him reading these out in the class. You must remember I was much the youngest in the class and from the Berrystead, which was a very low place, and paper and string and wood with a combination produced by one Hinde from the Berrystead, I believe. Absolutely putting down. But he was a wonderful, and he, at the end of that term, he called me out after chapel and said, well, Hinde, I think you better come to my house. And so he took me away from the headmaster's house, and he was a wonderful bachelor housemaster who did all sorts of things with the boys. He had music concerts on Sunday night, and he was a keen naturalist. He wrote a very good book on flowers of the coast for the New Naturalist series. He took boys rock climbing, and he used to take me out bird watching a lot to places around Oundle. So I owe him a very great debt. He wasn't the only master at Oundle I owed a lot to. I mean, the headmaster was a keen bird watcher, and he used to take me out in his car sometimes. And the very end of my time at Oundle, the war was beginning, and his son, who was a man called James Fisher, a famous ornithologist who started the New Naturalist series, his wife came to teach, and she taught me English, and she played an enormously important part in my life in making me, if I may say so, not just a scientist, by supplying me with books to read during the war and all that sort of thing.
What was the subject that Hepburn was meant to be teaching? I mean, was he chemistry or physics or?
Who?
Hepburn. Yeah.
Hepburn was a chemist.
A chemist.
Yes.
So did you do chemistry and physics and so on at A level?
Yes, I wasn't allowed to do biology at school because that was the dung sixth for farmers, and it was felt that if I was going to be a scientist, I was absolutely no good at Latin, and I was thrown out of the classical side really, and chemistry, physics and maths.
And were there any other hobbies that you had apart from bird watching? I mean, were you interested in music or?
Not especially. I haven't got any ear at all. I used to go fishing, a certain amount. I collected butterflies. There was another headmaster who was very good to me, called Captain Collier, MC, who'd retired from the Indian Army and gave up shooting tigers in favour of collecting butterflies, I think. And he was quite an important influence on my life. So from Arundel, I got a great deal of encouragement from the staff in natural history pursuits and in general, any sort of intellectual thing. I didn't make many friends amongst the boys. Arundel prided itself, and I'm sure I'm offending you, in taking boys from the industrial north.
You're not offending me, because we used to play rugby against you, and
Where were you then?
I was at Sedbergh.
Oh, were you? Yes.
And it was just the same. We were turning mill lads
Yes.
into young gentlemen and so on. So I went through the same thing a bit further north than you, so
Yes.
I know what it was like. Were you bullied at all, or?
Yes, I think I was a little, but not very badly.
So where did you finally came to Cambridge, but where did you apply? Was Cambridge the
I
only place?
applied to Emmanuel College, and I took a scholarship there at the beginning of the war, and I did reasonably well on chemistry and physics, but failed on maths, so I didn't get a scholarship. But after I'd been in the Air Force for about 6 months, this is a dreadful story, it's the height of nepotism.
Okay. Do you want this expunged from the
No,
record?
it's all right. My headmaster, who'd been a bird watcher and became almost a friend, wrote to me and said, "I've arranged for you to have a close exhibition at St John's College." You will remember that close exhibitions in those days were limited to certain schools, and there was more or less in the headmaster's jurisdiction to arrange them. So, I think to my great misfortune, great good fortune, I went to St John's and not to Emmanuel. Emmanuel had been my father's college and my brother's college and various other things.
If you hadn't got this exhibition, would you have gone to Emmanuel?
Yes.
Yes. You'd been admitted but hadn't got an exhibition, was that?
Yes, I think so. I don't remember the details, to be quite honest.
Yeah. And you came up to read biology, or?
Well, I went into the war.
Oh, that's right.
In those days, at that time...
What year is this?
Must have been 40, I think.
Yeah.
You could sign on for aircrew at 17 and a quarter, which I did, and passed all the medicals and things, but they didn't call me up until the end of that year, which must have been 41. And so I stayed on at Arundel, and then I worked, had a lovely few months working for the Young Men's Christian Association, driving a van, taking tea round to the anti-aircraft sites and the aerodromes and places in Norfolk. And I also worked with James Fisher, my headmaster's son, who was doing rat research, trying to control rats in the Port of London, which became a crucially important issue in the war because of the food shortages. And while I was working with him, I remember going to the telephone in the London Zoo and being told that my brother was missing. My brother was the eldest in the family. He was a RAMC doctor and a troop ship. His troop ship was torpedoed. And my father was, my parents, I should say, didn't hear any news of him for about 3 or 4 months. They could get nothing out of the War Office. And eventually they found a letter in a Liverpool newspaper, or was sent one, which said something about the survivors, and my father got in touch with one of them eventually, and learned that my brother had died a very horrible, slow death of wounds and exposure in an open boat in the Atlantic. And it's not only the nature of his death, but the effect it had on my parents, which was exacerbated a couple of years later when they heard that I was missing, and the Air Ministry refused to say that I was very happy and alive. But the effect of bereavement is something that isn't often talked about when people are talking about the effects of war. I should also have said that, while I'm talking about this, that in my childhood I lived next door to a family of which there was a boy a year older than me, a boy the same age as me, and a girl a bit younger than me, and we were very close indeed. And Graham, the one who was my immediate contemporary, who was actually 3 months older than me, also died in the war, shot down over the Ruhr in 1944, and it was that comes later in my life, really, doesn't it? So
But these are the seeds of your later interest in war.
Yeah.
Do you think the work with the YMCA was also seeds for your later interest in religion, or that's rather a frivolous
Not
question?
in the least, no. I was the only young man with 5 very beautiful women, and we used to have a lovely time. There's nothing at all to do with
Christianity.
So then, eventually I was called up and went out to what was then Southern Rhodesia to train as a pilot. And they were getting enough pilots by then, and they got more people out there than they needed. And so I was hanging around in the initial training wing for a long time, in which we were tested on sums like, if 2 men dig a trench 20 feet long in 3 days, how long do 4 men take, etc., all that stuff, which was really very, very elementary and easy for me. And then I went on to flying training school and flew Tiger Moths, through service flying training school on Speed Oxfords, and then eventually, and then I was, a whole group of us was selected for Coastal Command, and I was sent down to George in South Africa to train as a navigator, because Coastal Command pilots were trained as both pilots and navigators. And then I came home on a troop ship via South America. It took weeks and weeks, in fact months and months, to get home. And I was on a fairly fast troop ship that didn't have an escort, and we had to watch for submarines. And I used to watch for submarines with another young man who trained as a bomb aimer. And I was then a mild Christian, I'd say a skeptical Christian, and he was a passionate atheist. And we talked for weeks and weeks and weeks as we watched for submarines. And when we got to England, he was a Christian and I was an atheist. We sort of converted each other. And that was something that I then put on the back burner and came back to in my retirement.
Mm. How was it? Well, there must be further service because you go missing.
Yes, and eventually I joined a Catalina crew and was flying boats and was posted to a squadron operating in the Indian Ocean from what was then Ceylon, with an outstation in the southernmost of the Maldive Islands, and we were looking for the Japanese fleet and Japanese submarines. And it meant very long trips over the sea of 18 hours or so. Take off in the early morning, meet a convoy at daylight, stay with it all day, and then fly home again, that sort of thing. Or simply searching for the Japanese fleet. It was not especially dangerous. I am glad to say that I was never involved in killing anybody, and I was never in contact with the enemy. We were simply looking for them. And all the casualties that Coastal Command, no, that's an exaggeration, but many of the casualties, the dangers, were either running out of fuel on these long trips, or weather, or while we were in England flying into a mountain in bad weather. They were those sorts of dangers rather than enemy action, except for one crew which did find the Japanese fleet and lasted just long enough to get off a radio message before the Zeros got them. Then I came back to England, trained as a Sunderland pilot, and then did a few operational trips, but the war was then over. Mm-hmm. And because I had an exhibition at St John's College, as I've told you, I spent a week's leave convincing the Air Ministry that a close exhibition was a very special form of scholarship and entitled me to an early release from the Air Force. And so I managed to get up to Cambridge in January 46, which was ahead of most of the...
You had missed a term, but you came in on the second term.
I came in the second term, and of course, as an ex-serviceman, I didn't have to keep the 9 terms.
Are there any, I mean, it's interesting how many of the people I've interviewed had that big break experience in the Second World War, including Sir Andrew Huxley, who I've been talking to about his work with Alan Hodgkin and so on. Are there any reflections you want to make about how that experience influenced your later work? I mean, presumably didn't influence your academic work so much as...
Well, I did a good deal of bird watching whenever I could. And in fact, the first academic lecture I gave was to the Oxford Bird Club on the birds of southern Rhodesia, which is a real dreadful, makes me cringe when I think of it. I did start to take an external London degree by correspondence and took the I took zoology and subsidiary chemistry, and I took the subsidiary chemistry and passed that, so that I only had the zoology to take, and I eventually did finish that off immediately after my Cambridge degree, and got a class lower in London than I got at Cambridge, because it was an extremely factual exam, the external degree, and I just didn't know the stuff.
So you had two undergraduate degrees?
Yes. I thought at that time I would get a couple of extra votes out of them, but they abolished the part of the university seats in Parliament.
At Cambridge you were reading biology?
In Cambridge I read natural sciences.
Natural sciences.
And it was initially physiology, chemistry and zoology. And then part 2 zoology. I got a 2-1 in my first year and then a first in the 2 succeeding years. But I spent a great deal of my time on the Cambridge sewage farm, where it was a marvellous place for migrant birds. And I published a few papers on migrant waders and organised a watch at different sewage farms all over the country, so that we could see whether the waders came through on a broad front or in a narrow stream, and relate the arrival of the waders to warm temperatures in Corunna, and that sort of thing. And during that time I was fortunate in coming across a bird on the Cambridge sewage farm which had never bred in Britain before. At least, so I believe, and so did James Fisher and all the famous ornithologists in Britain who flocked to see it, believed. And that was the moustached warbler. The record was accepted by the British Ornithologist Union Records Committee and has been until last year, when it was questioned by some new upstart and has now been taken off the British record list. But anyway, it was very important to me because it got me my first job. I would also say that while we're talking about Cambridge, I did make a number of friends amongst the ex-servicemen, and one of the extraordinary things about it was, which I've only realised on reflection, and really only when one of them, a man with whom I shared a room, died at his memorial service, that we never talked to each other about our war experiences. Never. There was a man, the man with whom I shared a room had shot down 3 Junkers 88s in 50 minutes and was a DFC and an Air Force Cross. He got an Air Force Cross after the war for trying to fly British aircraft through the sound barrier, and he used to go up to 40,000 feet and go into a steep dive and see what happened, and only one aircraft came to pieces, but he never talked about it. There was another chap who had no legs, and I have a very vivid memory of we were all going to the pub together and he couldn't quite keep up. Come on, peg leg. And it was a sort of joke that he hadn't got any legs. But I never knew how he lost them. And that's something I've reflected a lot about more recently, actually.
It's obviously clearly a conscious, you're all aware that you've all been in the war and you consciously avoid the subject.
Yes, and the interesting thing is why. And it was partly not wanting to shoot a line, I think. Partly guilt of being a survivor, and in some cases guilt at having killed. But that was Cambridge.
Well, on Cambridge at that time, who were your teachers, and did any of them influence you a lot?
I think it's all right for this to go on the record.
Good.
I had 2 supervisors in St John's in zoology. Frank Hollick, who was very shy, and he used to sit on the edge of his chair in his room, and I used to sit on the edge of the chair in his room, and neither of us would say a word for what seemed like 10 minutes at a time. He was very interested in the aesthetics of animals, but not a very good teacher. And the other one was a man called Colin Bertram, also now dead, who had been in charge of fish cultivation on Cyprus during the war to feed the troops with carp. And about that time became secretary of the British Genetical Society or something, and was always talking about people being good breeding stock.
Something from late Victorian Galtonian genetics.
Yes, exactly. Social Darwinism.
There were no inspiring teachers you had in other subjects, or?
I don't think there were, quite honestly. There was a lovely man, Palmer, who taught me chemistry, who was incredibly old. He had white hair anyway. And, I remember when he interviewed me, just when I came up before I started, and I was in Air Force uniform, and he kept on saying, well, Hinde, I should rather do that, otherwise you'll find you've had it. And using little bits of Air Force slang to make me feel at home. He was a really lovely man. But
who was the master of St John's at that time? Do you remember?
A man called Benions, who was a classicist, and that was when I was an undergraduate.
Jack wasn't there then, was he? Jack Goody.
Yes, he was, but we didn't really know each other
See?
early on.
So at the end of your undergraduate degree, you got a first, and then what did you do then?
But then David Lack,
Oh yes, the famous Lack.
who was the ornithologist, had been to see the so-called moustache warbler, and he offered me a job as a research assistant in Oxford. And it was a research assistant that would allow me to do a DPhil, and he wanted me to do a comparative study of the feeding behaviour of rooks and jackdaws. And that struck me as incredibly boring. It was in relation to Gauss's hypothesis, which is very popular at the time, which said that no two species with the same ecology can exist together at the same time. And rooks and jackdaws appear to feed together, but so in some way they must not be competing. David was at that time moving from studying robins to studying great tits, the ecology of the great tit. And he said, well, why don't you do a behaviour study of the great tit? And so that's what I did. And it was a lovely time. Worked in a wood, Whiteham Wood, just outside.
Oh, yes, I know
Oxford.
Whiteham.
It's full of primroses, blackberries, sweet chestnuts.
Magical place, yes.
Magical place. And I used to just wander around with a notebook, a pair of field glasses, and write down what I saw. And it was just wonderful. It so happens that now my daughter, who's a research fellow at Newman now, is also studying great tits. But she has incredibly complicated apparatus and cameras in the nest box, loudspeakers, microphones. But what's been nice for me is that I've been able to work as her unpaid research assistant and go around the nest boxes and see whether there are any eggs in them in the early morning. That's another story.
Was David Lack a good supervisor?
No, he was not a good supervisor. He corrected the English in my papers. He wasn't especially, although he'd worked on behaviour of the robin, he wasn't especially interested in what I was doing. But I said I've been lucky all the way through. I was lucky to get into Coastal Command because I survived, and most people who went on, a high proportion of people who went into Bomber Command didn't. And I was lucky in Oxford because Nico Tinbergen came to Oxford when I was a DPhil student, had no students of his own, and so I had his undivided attention for a while, and he was the person who really influenced me in my subsequent work.
A very famous figure.
Yes.
Was he? He was a. Is there anything you want to say about him? I mean, he was.
Well, there are biographies of him, and it's no good my repeating them. But he was a very charismatic man who did everything himself. He never would put things on to his students or anything. But he made his students who were keeping sticklebacks go out and catch their own Daphnia to feed the sticklebacks on, for instance. I mean, he was all for doing things all the way through. And we spent a long time talking, and he was a great help to me.
Is it a coincidence? It's only a sample of two people, but Tinbergen and Lorentz are both sort of mid-European Viennese kind of names. This isn't part of the great surge of people from Middle Europe to Cambridge and Oxford during the war or after the war, is it?
No, I mean, far from it. Lorenz was an Austrian, actually, and joined the Nazi Party, and did some very interesting work in the 1930s, and in a sense got ethology going. Tinbergen was working independently in Holland, and got into contact with Lawrence shortly before the war. Lawrence was taken prisoner of war by the Russians and treated reasonably well, I think. Tinbergen was taken into a hostage camp by the Germans, where they took all the professors from Leiden, I think, and they took them out and shot one or two when the resistance did anything. So he had a rough time during the war. And I was the first conference where they met. It was very interesting after the war. And they both tried to have a good relationship with each other. But Nico said to me, the thing he couldn't bear was hearing German voices in the corridor outside his bedroom. That again is another story, sorry. But
that's a nice story. I mean, it's an interesting story.
They, although they were both passionately interested in animal behaviour, Lawrence was an ideas man, Tinbergen was an experimenter, and there were two ethologies, Lawrencean ethology and Tinbergen ethology, and I was very much influenced by Nico. Conrad was always very kind to me until I wrote a paper criticising his model. And then he used to talk about Nico and me as these English-speaking ethologists, as though we were a separate race. Oxford DPhil.
Yes.
Yeah. I was newly married and so didn't have much time for college life,
Yes.
though I was a member of Balliol.
Was this the time? Who was Master of Balliol? Was it Ramsay or?
I haven't the faintest idea, I'm afraid. I didn't ever come. Well, I suppose I must have come across him at some stage.
Clay or someone, yep.
And I did a DPhil in effectively 18 months. I was allowed to do it in 2 years. And it was so different then because, I mean, my DPhil was typed, not even bound properly, and very crude. And then, another piece of luck, Bill Thorpe of Jesus College here was wanting to start an ornithological field station to study the relation between instinct and learning. And he asked Lawrence to come and be the curator, and Lawrence had got another job. And he asked a man called Reg Moreau to do it, and he turned it down in the end. And so he asked me, and that was my great piece of luck. And I came in 1950 to Madingley, in January 1950, I think, and where I worked until I retired, really, from that sort of work. And it gradually, well, we spent the first year putting up a perimeter fence and putting up aviaries, and I learned how to creosote aviaries and creosote wood and wire things together and all that sort of thing, which was fun actually. We had no building except for a small Nissen hut which had been left over by the Home Guard, and which we used as a food store. The university had just bought the whole of the Madingley estate, and that's why Bill was able to establish it there. And then I did some more work on great tits and on the comparative courtship behaviour of finches and various other odds and ends for the first few years. And I did a little work on imprinting. And I did quite a lot of work on... Bill had been interested in how birds learnt or to build nests, or whether they did so instinctively. And so...
What did he decide? Because I was looking at a thrush's nest today, I was thinking, how, by natural selection, could a bird have learnt? I mean, what gene controls about nest building. I mean, it must have watched somehow the bird doing it.
You should know well enough as an academic. We didn't decide anything. It's a very interesting problem which is still not fully solved.
Yeah.
What one can show is that birds with no experience will build nests, but how much they learn in the course of building is a very interesting topic. And I got slightly diverted into studying the endocrinological basis of nest building because I wanted to have canaries that would breed all the year round. And that actually was turned out in quite an interesting way, because we could show the interaction between the changes in the external world, like daylight, the endocrine changes in the bird, the changes in the behavior of the bird which produced new stimuli to which it responded, which produced new endocrine changes in the bird, and that sort of thing. And I was working at the same time as somebody called Danny Lehrman, who was an important influence on comparative psychology and ethology, was working in Rutgers in the States. And he became one of my closest friends. He was a very overweight New York Jew, very clever, very bright, very verbal. And his work on that topic has been carried on in the Institute of Animal Behaviour in Rutgers to this day, and has been very productive indeed. At that time we used to see each other about once a year, one side or the other of the Atlantic. And I remember arriving in Idlewild, as Kennedy was then called, at 5 o'clock in the morning, being met by Danny, and he said, "Come on, Robert, we're going bird watching." and by 10 o'clock in the morning we'd seen 51 species of American bird.
Was that where Lionel Tiger was?
I believe he did go to Rutgers, yes. I'm sorry, I'm not being a very good interviewer because I easily get diverted.
No, it adds to the charm of it. You don't really get diverted, it's moving along. But there's a point where you move from birds to primates.
I want to say one more thing about birds. The other thing I was extremely fortunate about was it was so easy to get money then. And I had one grant application turned down on the grounds that I hadn't asked for enough money. Could I use twice as much? To which I said yes. But I want to tell you this story. I got in contact with, or I think he got in contact with me, a colonel in the United States Air Force who was based in Brussels. And he came to see the work that I was doing with canaries. And I took him into hall, and we had some wine in hall. And then I took him back to my room, and he drank scotch. And at 1 o'clock in the morning he said, "Well, we'll write your grant application." And he succeeded to write my grant application for me to the American Air Force. And it was called Nest Building Skills in Canaries. The skills what you fly a bomber with. And he insisted that I should say that I'd been a pilot so that I should know the relevance of this. And they supported me in the system for 3 years. And then he came back and the whole procedure went through again. And at 1 o'clock in the morning he said, "Well, now we'll write your renewal." And this time it was called sensory deprivation in canaries, because it was getting into the space age and everybody was interested in sensory deprivation. And sometimes I used to take the nest material away from the death. So that made it okay. I met him years later, and he said his aim in life, he was really a cardiac physiologist, his aim in life had been to see what he could put across the generals in Washington. And I was his second best. The first the best had been a study of Indian fakirs on the grounds that they would help American airmen to survive if they came down in the sea. Mine was the second best, so I was very proud of that.
Perhaps he was the person who sponsored that famous project which I heard about, the irrelevant behaviour of the Barbary dove. This was cited as, the acme of useless.
Yeah, but that was Senator Proxmire.
Was it?
Who was a senator who tried to stop any payment for pure research.
That's right.
By purporting that it was really useless.
Yes, that's right. It was a famous test case of
Yeah.
how irrelevant could it be. So, should we move on to?
Yeah, monkeys. Well, I want to say one other thing. During this time, I was existing for several years without a proper job from year to year. Then, as I was made a senior assistant in research, and eventually an assistant director of research, but I never had a proper lectureship. And the best thing that ever happened to me in my life was that I applied for a demonstratorship in psychology and didn't get it.
You'll have to explain why it was so good, but you didn't get it. You might have gone into a terrible career, or.
Well, because I would not have done the research I was able to do. I'd have had to do a lot of teaching, and I was much freer to do research, and freer to do research of the sort that I wanted to do. I mentioned earlier that I did a certain amount of work on imprinting, this parent-offspring relationship in birds, and this came to the ears of a man called John Bowlby, who was a London
very famous John Bowlby,
psychoanalyst. And at that time he was very concerned with the fact that parents were not allowed to visit their children in hospital, or at any rate visiting hours were restricted often to half an hour a week. I think my voice is going to go soon.
We'll have a break in a minute. Do you want to have a break now, or you're right?
No, it's all right. Restricted to half an hour a week, and he felt this was a very bad thing for personality development in the children, because pre-war he'd worked a lot with adolescents who'd got into trouble, and found that nearly all of them had had a separation experience from their parents in youth. And this was only clinical evidence, and he wanted experimental evidence to try and confirm his thesis. And I used to go down to seminars at the Tavistock Clinic in London, which was then in Beaumont Street. We used to meet in a tiny basement room with a dirty, dusty window opening up onto the pavement, pavement above it. And it was a most wonderful seminar that he used to run, where there was a Freudian analyst, a Kleinian analyst, a Hullian learning theorist, a Skinnerian learning theorist, a Piagetian, an anti-psychiatrist, Ronnie Lang, used to come along sometimes, myself as an animal chap, and one or two psychiatric social workers. And what was
Melanie Klein, was she around? Was Melanie Klein of that generation, or?
John Bowlby was a Kleinian.
Yeah, yes, yeah.
The wonderful thing about it was that we had nothing theoretically in common, but a common interest in parent-offspring relationships. And that taught me such an important lesson, that the important thing is not the theory, but the problem, and to go for the problem and not to try and prove or disprove theories all the time. After I'd been going to the seminar for a year or two, John helped me get money to set up a rhesus monkey colony in Cambridge, which we did with the help of the Rockefeller and Mental Health Research Fund and various other things. And we had 6 groups of rhesus monkeys, each with a male, 3 or 4 females, and they're young. And we spent a lot of time working out methods of recording behaviour which in itself was worthwhile because those comparable methods were much used in the field by primatologists subsequently, and were able to show in the end that a 10-day separation could produce effects that we could pick up 10 days later. 10-day separation could pick up effects that we could pick up 2 years later in their inability to cope with stressful situations. And that took about 10 years, and we were able to contrast what happens with situations comparable to mother goes to hospital, infant stays at home, infant goes to hospital, mother stays at home, both go to hospital together, both go to different hospitals, if you see what I mean. And what was interesting was that the symptoms were exactly the same in monkeys as they are in school children, in young children, but the details differed because of the different social structure of monkeys. I won't bother you with the details, but it made me realise both the value of comparative studies and their great danger.
I can see the value. What is the great danger?
Well, I have to explain that, roughly speaking, it was this, that in humans, the child is less effective if the mother goes to hospital and he stays at home in the familiar environment. Whereas in the monkeys it was the other way round. And the reason it was the other way round was because if the mother had been to hospital, when she came back, she had to re-establish her relationships with all the other group members and didn't have any time for this demanding infant. So it was that social factor that made a difference, and you've got to look at the whole situation to see whether the results are transferable or not. But anyway, it did help John to get the hospital regulations changed.
It was a very famous shift, I remember. I was married to a psychiatric social worker at that time.
Oh, yes.
My first wife, and she was brought up on Bowlby and people. And you remained a friend and colleague of John's?
He remained a friend and colleague, and my second wife works in attachment theory still. And attachment theory has become probably the most influential theory in child development now.
Have you looked at all at the sort of wider comparative ways of bringing up children in different cultures?
No, but it's a very, I mean, Mary Ainsworth, who was a colleague of John Bowlby's, had worked with the Buganda in Uganda, and her emphasis was on the similarities, of course, and the importance of contact comfort and that sort of thing. There's been a lot of comparative work done, but I haven't been involved in it.
Erickson and people, because, for example, comparing the English, who I've written about and have a tension because of their individualistic market capitalist social structure, they immediately from birth, parents are giving signals to the children that they've got to learn to stand on their own 2 feet and be separated, because the nuclear family system will mean that in their teens they will be leaving, as compared to the Japanese, for instance, who, as you know, they sleep with their children and they keep them very, very tightly bound together.
And the mother holds the baby looking at her and playing with her hair, whereas American mothers, they're looking outwards.
That's right. Even down to wonderful details which I've had explained to me, that when a Japanese feeds a baby, she gets down to the same eye level as the baby, and if the baby picks up a spoon and can't really use it very well, the mother will not take it away and feed the baby, but will guide the hand to help it, as if, I am helping you do these things. Whereas the English and French mothers will say, it's feeding time, I better do this, and spoon it in. So all sorts of differences.
Very wonderful things happened for me during that time. One was that I got a letter from the President of the Royal Society saying, "You will have heard that we have established these Royal Society research professorships. Would you like one?" Well, I hadn't heard, but I said yes, I would like one. So that was lovely, and it just has given me an opportunity to follow my research interests wherever they led me.
What year was this?
I think it was 1963.
Hmm.
And
Do you know how that happened? It's a dream
no,
come
but
true.
I strongly suspect Nico Tinbergen and Thorpe.
Hmm.
I mean, neither of them would ever say anything to me.
Hmm. Nico Tinbergen and...
Bill Thorpe,
Oh,
who
yes, yeah.
started the Mattingly thing.
Oh yes, yeah.
I was his 2IC, really.
Hmm.
And I think I've strayed a bit apart from the Royal Society, but it's been, I think, it's been wonderful for me anyway.
Hmm.
Whether I've been doing what they would want me to do, I don't know. The other wonderful thing that happened was that Louis Leakey was looking, had come to the conclusion that the secret of man's origins lay with the great apes, and that women were better at studying animals than men. And he'd found this girl called Jane Goodall, and he wanted her to get a PhD, and he wanted someone to supervise her. And since Professor Hall at Bristol was the only other person working with monkeys, and he died through a monkey bite, so I was the only person in Britain who knew anything about non-human primates. I knew nothing about chimpanzees, but it gave me an opportunity to supervise her, and later to supervise Diane Fossey on gorilla, and to spend time at their camps, getting all the excitement and pleasure out of research on chimps and gorillas without having to do any of the hard work, and subsequently of supervising many students who worked on their camps. So that was a very good time for me. It was a very good break. And although I never did any field work on non-human primates, I've had an enormous number of children.
Freudian
It's
slip.
a very Freudian slip.
Yes.
Enormous number of students, some of whom have become very distinguished, who were working on at those two sites, mostly at those two sites, but also some working on elephants and other African animals. Quite an experience to supervise Jane Goodall.
I was going to ask what she was like, yes.
Well, in an essay about her life, she said that after supervisions with me, she used to go back to her digs and weep and throw all her books into a corner. Which I think is a bit unfair on me, actually, because neither she nor Diane Fossey really liked writing academic stuff. And she taught me an enormous lot, both of them did, principally that animals were individuals and not just members of a species. And my orientation had always been, up to that point, of thinking of them as members of a species. And she taught me that they were all individuals. Jane often claims that she made me give our monkeys names, but that's not true. We were giving her our monkeys names long before I knew her, but that was more as a matter of convenience and not as a matter of personality differences in the monkeys. Diane Fossey was a rather different cup of tea. She lived in a camp was in a very different environment. I think it was about 9,000 feet in the, I'm not sure whether it was as high as that, but I think it was, in the Virunga volcanoes. Gorilla were much more difficult to see than the chimpanzees. I remember one time when we went out, soon after I got there, we tracked them for several hours and eventually came up on them. And they were habituated to her, but as soon as they saw me, they took off. And Diane turned to me and said, "Robert, they think you're a silverback. Put your hat on," because my hair had recently gone grey. And I never had the courage to do the experiment properly and take it off again on future occasions. Diane lived in a more disease-free but much more unpleasant environment on top of these volcanoes. And what I learnt about her, which not many people know, is that she had an absolute phobia of heights. And one day, a photographer, Alan Root, and I and Diane and a research student of mine, a former research student called Thelma Rowell, were tracking the gorilla, and the gorilla went down a deep sort of crevasse down the volcano and up the other side, and we had the choice of going down and up, or no, sorry, they crossed the crevasse. We had the choice of going down and up and climbing up the steep cliff on the other side. And Alan Root said to me, he knew Diane much better than I did at that point, "Robert, you go first, then Diane, then me and Thelma at the back, and then we'll be all right." And I didn't know what he was talking about, but I clambered up this cliff and got just about to the top, and Diane was behind me, and she froze and couldn't move. And he pushed from behind, and I reached down from on top and got hold of her flies and of her trousers and pulled, and all the fly buttons came off, but we got her up to the top, and she just sat there for several minutes frozen and then went on again. And I think it's a tribute to her enormous courage that she continued to work for years and years and years on those mountains when she had this fear of heights. One thing I'd like to say about that period in my life is that it was a wonderful time at Madingley, because we had these field workers coming back to write up their stuff or preparing to go out into the field, and there was a wonderful camaraderie in the lab at that time, which has not been quite the same. Well, I mustn't say that because I haven't been there all the time, but it was, I think, very remarkable. And one of them said to me only yesterday, he was visiting from the States, that they all looked back on that time as a very unique time, and that they didn't know any other laboratory that had that sort of feeling about it. People coming from, on the whole, rather nasty places, and passionately interested in animals, passionately interested in their research, and being able to communicate with each other because there was no rivalry or anything of that sort.
The three people who I sort of vaguely associate with, but I don't know whether they were linked or not, were Pat Bateson.
He was my student early on. He was my first, almost my first student on imprinting, yes.
But was he at Madingley?
Oh yes.
Yeah. And the other is Nick Humphrey?
Nick Humphrey came to Madingley as a visitor. Let's not talk about Nick. He's a friend of mine, but I think it's sad that he hasn't achieved more.
Well, I remember him telling me that he'd taken a Faustian compact at some party, which was when he went into television. And
yes.
The other was, I'm trying to remember his double-barreled name. He was at King's, who worked on Red Deer.
Captain Brock.
Captain Brock. Was he anything to do? He was at something to do with the research centre.
Oh yes, at the research centre. Yeah.
Yeah.
And he's done very well indeed.
Yeah.
He's responsible for meerkats being a popular animal everywhere.
Is he? I didn't know that. So this was a really wonderful time. You were aged between roughly what and what when this was happening?
Well, let's say in 1968 I would have been 45.
Born in 23, were you?
Born in 23,
Yeah.
yes.
45.
And it was in the next decade after that, really. Or 15 years after that.
Was this, I mean, often research laboratory groups like the Cambridge Group for the History of Population and Social Structure, which I knew well, have a great moment of charismatic enthusiasm at the beginning, in the first 10 years, because you said earlier, they have a focused problem and they don't really mind about the disciplines. But as with Max Weber, charisma can turn to routinization
Yes.
over time rather easily.
Mm.
Do you think that was part of it? That this was a very good time to be
It
studying?
was a very good time, but it was, I mean, it didn't come at the beginning.
Mm.
It came in the middle of my time.
Mm.
And it was the coming together of these lovely young people.
Mm.
And they weren't all in Africa. I've had students on Cayo Santiago, for instance, and Puerto Rico, in South Africa. It was a very happy time. It was also happy for me in that I was married for the second time after a rather sticky divorce in 1971, I think it was.
So what was the next phase in your life after that?
Well, I decided that, I have to say, and this sounds a very funny thing to say, but I've always wanted to make the world a better place. I think I had 3 uncles in the church, and maybe that had something to do with it.
Yes.
And my father had intended to be a medical missionary, but lost his faith when he was an undergraduate at Emmanuel. And that's always been very important to me. And when I was first a fellow at St John's, there were 5 historians in the college, fellows, all of whom became very distinguished subsequently. And they used to laugh at me, and they'd say, "Here's young Hinde. He thinks he's going to make the world a better place. We historians, by studying chaffinches behind a pub in Madingley, we historians, we know the world will never be a better place." And I used to think they were a lot of cynical bastards.
One of them became a master, did he, or was that?
Yeah, Hensley was.
Hensley.
Yes. But they were all. Thistlethwaite, who was a well-known American historian. Robinson, who was professor at Oxford. Anyway.
Robinson and Gallagher, yes. So how were you going to make the world a better place?
And so I wanted to, I thought it's really better to study children than study monkeys. And so I recruited Judy Dunn, who you know, to the unit, and she helped me get interested in child development. But I was really interested in mother-child relations, and we didn't agree about attachment theory. That's another issue. But what happened was that she pursued her own work, and I started a study with my second wife, Joan Stevenson Hinde, of 4-year-olds and their mothers. And I worked in nursery schools with the 4-year-olds, and she worked in the homes. And it was a wonderful time for me because I was the white-haired professor who came to watch the children, but I was also the only man about the place who got sent out to clear the snow out of the gutters or mend the fuses or sweep up the floor after school, that sort of thing. You can't work in a nursery school unless you become part of it. And we did a certain amount of worthwhile work, but Joan got interested in shyness in children, and she's gone on to do really very remarkable work, so that she's a sort of international figure in the attachment field. My work has been, I tried too hard to use the recording techniques which had done so well for monkeys, for children, and they just weren't applicable. And in a certain sense I wasted a certain amount of those years. They weren't especially fruitful years.
What were they recording? You mean film or tapes?
No, pencil and paper.
You mean noting the number of interactions and this sort of thing?
Yes, on a check sheet.
Yeah.
Well, mostly it was audio tape, which we subsequently coded.
Yeah.
But Joan has done wonderful things since then, and is still writing papers about the relation between the mother's personality and shyness in children in relation to their relationship.
Yeah.
In attachment theory terms.
How did you think that studying 4-year-old children, it's not perhaps as irrelevant as chaffinches behind the pub, but how was this going to make the world a better place?
Well, I thought if we understand how humans behave, and it's exactly what you think too,
Yes,
so
yeah.
don't beat around the bush.
Yes.
That you've thought the same thing, I'm sure.
Yes, I have. Yes. But I like to hear it coming back to me from other people. Again, I wondered whether you'd thought of doing something comparative. I mean, I've done 2 studies of 4-year-olds, or rather 2 studies of children growing up from the age of 2 to the age of 10, using film and participant observation as an anthropologist, namely a little girl growing up in the Himalayas in Nepal and her interactions with her mother, who was my adopted sister, over that period, and also of my granddaughter, or step-granddaughter, which is rather important because they're not my blood.
Yeah.
And I've been filming and observing them until now, which is 10-year-old. And what I want to do one day is to do a comparative study to see what's in common, what's different about this very intense, not just in a school, but the whole of life, you know, not the toilet, but
Sure.
almost everything else, the bathing, the washing, the cleaning, the grooming.
Sure.
Because what strikes me, obviously, at first impression is the similarities. Although, you know, one is a Buddhist culture in Annapurna Mountains and one is a little Australian girl in Cambridgeshire, but the eye movements, everything you can pick out on film, the mouth, the contacts between her and her mother, and the teaching and the art and everything, a lot of similarity.
Yes. Tell me something, when you were working in Nepal, did you come across, well, I'll tell you why I asked. I had an acupuncture treatment for a while with someone for a muscle thing, and she told me that she'd worked for Save the Children Fund in Nepal and had come across 3 or 4 cases of grandmothers lactating while they looked after the children.
I've seen it, yes.
You've seen it too, that's very interesting.
Yes. I mean, 2 or 3 cases I've seen in the village. I mean, I'd have to check with my wife, who has a better knowledge of this, but it'll all be in our database. And you know, you actually saw this 40, 50, 60-year-old lady doing breastfeeding, and
Yes.
it just been through arousal, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it's very interesting.
Anyway, let's come back to children and saving the world. The other part of saving the world was, which is very important, is your very distinguished work in relation to pugwash and.
Well, that comes much later.
Okay, well, you take it in order then. What's next?
During that period of the 80s, 70s, 80s, I started a thing in Cambridge called the Cambridge Association Against Nuclear Warfare or something like that. And we had, Pat was involved in it too, in a dilatory sort of way.
Pat Bateson, yes.
Yes. And we had a series of lectures and meetings and so on. And then I got involved in ex-servicemen's CND. The point there being that CND was always portrayed on the media as being long-haired hippies with torn jeans and all that sort of thing. And we used to go along on the parades with our best suits on and our medals and grey hair and all that sort of thing, and try and make it respectable. And I remember standing outside the cenotaph in a demonstration we were doing one day, and meeting a friend who worked in one of the ministries, coming and saying, what are you doing here?
Matter out of place, yes.
And from that, I graduated into pugwash. And pugwash, as you know, do you know?
Yes.
Do I have to say this?
Well, say it a little, because I did interview Martin Rees, and he explained quite a bit about pugwash, but
Yes.
that's a separate interview, so tell us about it.
Pugwash is an organisation that grew out of the Russell-Einstein Manifesto, which Einstein's was probably the last thing Einstein ever signed, and was really motivated by Bertrand Russell in 1955 against nuclear weapons. But it gave rise to a series of conferences which are called the Pugwash Conferences on Science and World Affairs, the first meeting of which was held in 1957 and involved scientists from both sides of the Iron Curtain, and has had, I think it's 57 annual meetings in 50 years or something in the best traditions, and also many workshops, mostly on nuclear weapons, but on many other aspects of science and human affairs in the meanwhile. And eventually got the Nobel Peace Prize was divided between the movement and its main motivator, Sir Joseph Roteblat, in 1995. And I became involved in that in the 80s, and it works primarily, or did work then, primarily at the political level, and tries to get the right scientific insights across to the politicians. And the politicians have listened because of its impeccable scientific integrity. Joe Roteblat would never exaggerate the effects of a nuclear weapon or anything of that sort. He always said it has to be absolutely accurate. And that's taken, in retirement, has taken up a lot of my time. And but can I come to that in due course?
Yeah.
In 1989, I was somewhat against my will elected Master of St. John's, because but I was due to retire from my research professorships at 65, so I didn't mind too much, but it meant I couldn't do any research, or much research, for 5 years. I really enjoyed being master in many ways. What I liked about it was, it's terrible, but being the sort of centre of things, and you'd walk across the court and meet a porter who had something to say to you, or senior tutor, or one of the undergraduates, or the lady superintendent, and you felt as though you were in the middle of the web, as it were. And I did enjoy that feeling very much. I had to spend a lot of time raising money for a new undergraduate library. One of the troubles with your sitting in the window is that I want to look out at the light somehow, so it's difficult for me to keep on looking at it.
Well, look at the light. It doesn't make too much difference.
What was I going to say?
You were raising money for this
raising
library.
money for the library. And I did about 60 meetings all over the country and in the States and Canada and France and places. And they were quite fun in a way, although I resented the time on them, because the people who used to come were the loyal Jonians. And I used to give them a couple of drinks and then give them a little talk about how badly we needed money, and ask for questions, and I was always terrified that they'd ask me questions about the accounts, which I wasn't really too good on. But the commonest question I had was, tell me, Master, do the porters still wear top hats? You know, all the nostalgia came out, and it was really lovely, actually.
The famous porters of St. John's.
Yes.
Head porter of St. John's, worldwide acclaim. And you raised some money.
And we raised several million, which enabled us to build, I think, a very satisfactory undergraduate library. Big debates as to whether it was right to have it open all night or whether the undergraduates ought to be going to sleep, which eventually it was agreed that it would stay open all night. And I remember looking out of my window in the Master's Lodge, which I was then occupying, at 4 o'clock in the morning, and seeing 7 heads bent over desks, and I thought, it's working.
Well, as long as they weren't bent over in sleep. Yeah. So, you mainly enjoyed it. There must have been, apart from not being able to get on with your research, were there any other downsides?
No, John's, if I may say this to a fellow of King's, it's a lovely college.
I'm sure it
was a very cooperative college at that time, and I had no major rows of any sort to deal with. It was, everybody was really motivated in the same way, and that was really very nice. I had a new domestic bursar, but he was very good and settled into the job very quickly.
The dispute about women in St. John's was before your time.
It was before my time.
That
was, well, everybody was happy about that, or at least pretended they were happy, so there were no problems. You know, the building of the library was the big issue, and that did take up a lot of my time. I did write some papers during that period, but I couldn't. I began to feel itchy because, having had a Royal Society professorship and having done nothing but research all my life, really, it was a bit of a...
So you've never been heavily involved in lecturing, for instance, university lecturing?
No. When I was an assistant director of research at SAR, I used to give a course of lectures on animal behaviour in zoology, and I continued to give a few lectures every year, and from about, I don't know when it was, but I suppose about the mid-90s or early 90s, I've been lecturing on personal relationships to social and political scientists. And I gave that up when I was 80 because I thought it was improper for somebody of 80 to be lecturing on love to young students. Still, Joan and I are involved in a course of lectures in psychology, and I give 2 of them. So I still have
a niche.
little bit, but not anything you'd call a teaching load.
You like lecturing? Enjoy it?
Yes, I do quite.
Mm.
But I'd like to have done more. My contacts to although I was a tutor in John's for several years, I missed that out. Can I go back on
Yes, yes.
that? In the 50s, when I was very insecure and didn't have a proper job, St John's made me steward, and I was in charge of the food in the hall and of the undergraduates' wine cellar. And what John's didn't know was that I had no taste buds and no special interest in either wine or food.
Perhaps they did know.
But
Anyway.
I'd been a kitchen manager in the post for 40-something years, so nothing I could say made any difference. But I learned a very important lesson from the wine merchants who came to see me every term, because I learned that if you say to each one what the previous one said to you, you only make a fool of yourself once a term. And that was about once in 10 times or something. And I reckon that I've been through my life not minding if I made a fool of myself once in 10 times, and that's probably paid off. And then after 2 or 3 years they got fed up with me as steward and made me a tutor instead. And I enjoyed that, and gave me some contact with undergraduates, which I haven't personal contact with undergraduates. I mean, most of my contact has been with graduate students rather than undergraduates, and that was a good period. And I did that until 1963, when I got so I did it for about 5 years, when I got the Royal Society Research Professorship, which had one strict rule, and that is you mustn't do anything you don't want to do attached to it. And I had to give up supervising.
Sounds like something out of Oscar Wilde. A sort of, I have a strict rule. I'm sorry, I'd love to do this, but I'm precluded from doing anything I really don't want to do, and I really don't want to do this, so I can't.
I know it was Oscar Wilde's idea, but it was really what a Royal Society Research Professorship.
I made it up, but it's sort of bumbering of some kind.
Yes.
A tutor, I ought to explain, wasn't a supervisor. You were a sort of moral tutor.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So
that was the end of the national service period. So I had some national servicemen and some straight undergraduates. That was quite interesting too.
Returning to the Pugwash and the CND, I know that you've written and edited books on war and its causes. And I've lectured on war, and I've come to the conclusion that there are too many causes for me to. I mean, you really have to differentiate between the levels of civilization. The causes of war in the modern world are not the same as those in the Yanomamo and the American Indians and so on. But out of all that work, did you come to any particular conclusions about?
Yes, which aren't too different from yours, I think. We mustn't have an argument about it. But I think there are an infinite number of causes of war, including things like poverty and land disputes and so on. But there are two things which are, well, first of all, that you've got to make a distinction between aggression of individuals, gang warfare, and institutionalized war, in which they're differentiated roles. And that's what we're really talking about most of the time. I don't know where war between Indian tribes would come on that, but somewhere in the middle. And that if you're going to have institutionalized war, then two things are essential and can be seen as the causes in a sense. One is the supply of weapons, and the other is young people willing to carry them. And my view is that although aggressiveness plays a part, the real issue is duty. And the pilot embarks on a mission not because he wants to kill people the other side, but because that's his duty. The tank commander advances because that's his duty. And it's a big institution, and the munition workers make weapons because that's their duty, and the transport workers make weapons, carry the weapons to the front because that's their duty, and so on. And the medics have their duties particular role, and that duty is the main issue, and that this institution is supported at three levels really. One is an everyday level. I'm only saying this on the condition that you tell me where you disagree with me.
No, I'm just listening.
One is the everyday level of the way history is taught, of stories about war, novels about war, films about war, and all that. Male chauvinism a bit. The second is cultural issues that persist over time, like the belligerence of the culture, patriotism nationalism as opposed to patriotism, and so on. And the third level is the military-industrial scientific complex, which itself is a nested series of sub-institutions, each of which is supported primarily by the career ambitions of those involved. That's my picture of it. Does that disagree very much?
No, not at all. I agree with everything. My views are put forward to my granddaughter Lily in the Why Do We Fight letter to her, which goes along the same lines. I think the most forceful thing which I drew out of it is that this naive assumption that the individual psychological drive of aggression has much to do with modern warfare, and indeed war in many societies is mistaken. That I came across this most forcefully in my life when I went to work in the Himalayas with the people who were recruited into the Gurkhas, because these are famed as the greatest medal winners and the most fierce people in the world, with their kukris and all the rest of it. But they were the very gentlest, non-aggressive people I've ever met. Once they get inside the structure of the British Army, they become very good soldiers, not because they are in the slightest bit aggressive, but because they obey their seniors and do what they're told without too much questioning. So the personal, psychological and the institutional are hardly congruent at all. So that was...
that's very interesting. It's exactly what I think that the problem comes from a confusion between aggression and aggressiveness.
Yes, exactly.
And when Germany walks into Poland, that's an act of aggression, but it doesn't imply that individual aggressiveness is involved at all.
Exactly. And I came across the same thing in studying Japan, because I spent a lot of time talking about the Japanese behaviour. And individual Japanese I know are almost uniformly very peaceful, very calm, very non-aggressive people. But the context changes and their loyalties particularly get inflamed, and they become extremely aggressive in certain ways. But there's nothing instinctive or basic individual psychology to do with it. Anyway, so I agree with you, but tell me what you think.
There's a very interesting book by somebody who, an anthropologist, a Japanese anthropologist who works at Madison, Wisconsin, on the kamikaze pilots, showing, it's called Cherry Blossom or something like that, showing how they didn't want to kill themselves, but the system was set up so that they somehow couldn't escape from it.
Well, I may land you with another book on Japan. We'll talk about that later. The other sort of theme that, again, I may be jumping too far ahead, but you're particularly interested in, I know, is religion and the causes thereof and the effects thereof, both religion and ethics. What do you think led to this interest, and what's it revolved around?
Well, it stemmed from, I'm sure, my upbringing and my four clerical uncles. And my mother, who was absolutely not very highly educated, passive, very wonderful, going to church you know, and getting, I'm sure, something out of it, because it was the thing that did. And my father's questioning his religion as a student and becoming an agnostic, but reverting to it in his old age, actually. And as I told you, I became an agnostic on this voyage during the war, and I put the whole thing on the back burner, and thought I didn't have to bother about that anymore. And when I retired, I thought I'd get back to it. So when I was Master of John's, I wrote a book on relationships and tried to bring that together, and did some stuff on war. But I also wrote a book called Why Gods Persist, which is trying to use all the biology and psychology and social science that I'd learnt over the years to bear on the question of why people believe in gods, why religion is so powerful. And I'm not keen on Richard Dawkins'
I was wondering about that.
denigration of religion, because I think a lot of people get a lot out of it. And the reason it persists is that a lot of people do get a lot out of it. And I could go into that in detail, but we won't bother now, I think. And I think there are two things that are wrong with that approach. One is that the religion is treated as a unitary entity, whereas following Malinowski, I would want to divide it into the structural beliefs, the narratives, the ritual, the moral code, the social aspects, and religious experience. And I think that each of those 6 elements are mutually supportive, but each of them can be to the advantage of individuals in some way. I'm less clear about religious experience, but the only progress I could make with religious experience, because I don't have it, is to see that the language in which people describe religious experience is very, very similar to the language that people use to describe aesthetic experience, except for the interpretation. And the interpretation is the specific thing about religious experience, so that you don't get Christians who've had visions of Buddha, for instance. So it's a sort of experience that's on top of the religious beliefs and so on. That's another issue. Anyway, then I got to feel that morality is the most important thing in the world today, and that part of the problems in the world are, although religion's done a wonderful job in purveying morality down the centuries, in this country at any rate, it's losing its grip a bit, and morality, we need really to understand where morality comes from and what its nature is. And so I wrote a book called Why Good is Good, trying to show that, well, the view is that what's basic and cross-cultural is something like do as you would be done by, or some aspect of it, and that you can, is compatible with or stems from the importance of exchange, and so on, and how moral precepts are passed on by an interaction between what people do and what they're supposed to do. sorry, I missed out a stage in that argument, which is that the do as you would be done by and exchange are sort of basic building blocks, but each society produces its own precepts which are compatible with that, but suit local conditions. So that the Ten Commandments, thou shalt not kill thy neighbour, you have to say thy neighbour, is compatible with do as you would be done by.
You have to say thy neighbour, but I don't remember Jesus saying thy neighbour. Or
You don't remember him? No.
I mean, you've added that.
But, no, I haven't added it. There's a view amongst Hebrew scholars that
The linguistic...
all those commandments should be qualified by thy neighbour. And the last one, thou shalt not covet thy neighbour's wife, is not the only one that refers to neighbour. And as you know, it comes in the Bible twice and there's dispute about it. But I insist on it being thy neighbour because we know very little about the evolution, or did know very little about the evolution of why people are nice and good. And the hypothesis that's getting more and more support is because early humans lived in groups which competed with each other, and you have to be cooperative, nice to people in your own group, but not in with the out group. So that's why I say that. And groups devised their own precepts, and the Ten Commandments are not universally applicable because they aren't applicable to people who don't have a institution of marriage, for instance. And that they're passed down through a dialectic between what people do and what they're supposed to do, so that in my lifetime that dialectic has led to divorce becoming more acceptable. When I was a boy in the 30s, it was completely
unacceptable.
Outside the pale. I've just finished another book which I think goes a little bit further and is trying to use an objective approach about how morality actually works in the real world. And when you come to look at it, we have rules, but in nearly every case we have a means of excusing ourselves from them. And I don't want to go into the whole business of the self-system now, but if you get accused of being something that you think you are not, like being dishonest, you either try to prove that you were honest, or that they are mistaken and they are inaccurate, or that you were being honest, really. But where this becomes important is in many institutions in our society, behaviour that is incompatible with the golden rule is either condoned or even encouraged. And in business, there's a thing called business ethics. You no longer do as you would be done by, you do the best for yourself. And that's justified by the economists saying it's good for the consumer. Competition is good for the consumer. And I think that's one of the exaggeration of that point of view is one of the worst things in the world today. In war, soldiers are encouraged to kill the outgroup. Politicians, by political necessity, have to lie some of the time. It's understandable that they lie, and so on. So that in each separate institution has its own way of excusing people from breaking rules. In law, for instance, you can't have a legal system without barristers who defend people that they aren't sure that they're not guilty, or accuse people who they think might be. And you have to have judges and jailers and things who are doing things that are completely incompatible with the non-verbal, with the
with the Bible, certainly, with the Golden Rule.
Mm.
Fascinating. Well, I look forward to that. What have we left out? You know your life better than I do. Are there any major people, any major themes that...
There are lots of people who've come into my life incidentally, like J.B.S. Haldane, for instance, was very encouraging to young people studying animal behaviour when I was starting off. He was a wonderful man. My first public lecture, apart from the Oxford one, was to the Zoological Society at University College, and it was a complete and total and utter disaster, because two students, one of whom was John Maynard Smith and the other was G.P. Wells, let a bat go into the auditorium, and it flitted in and out of the computer, the projector beam, and the whole audience was in hysterics the whole time, and I had an absolute terrible cold and could hardly speak. And J.B.S. Haldane came up to me afterwards and he said, "Hind, what you need is a drink. Let's go." And we went to the Marlborough Arms, and I remember him pushing me into a train later.
How sweet. Did you know C.H. Waddington, Caroline's?
No,
father?
I didn't know him, but of course I came across his work a lot.
What about themes? Any? I mean, you've had such a broad range of topics. We haven't touched on things that we've discussed, like incest behaviour and incest avoidance and kinship, and there are many others. But have we?
Well, that's all intrinsic to incest avoidance. Is the very interesting case of cultural precepts, of which biologists have one explanation and anthropologists have another. And I maintain that they're not wholly incompatible. I mean, there is hard evidence that inbreeding in humans is deleterious, but it's perfectly true that many marriage rules have nothing to do with close relationships, but with close genetic relationship, but may nevertheless have stemmed from that feeling that you mustn't, it's not a good thing to have children with a close relative. I mean, that's a very interesting case. There are lots of things like that we could talk about, but I think that would take us too far afield, probably.
Well, you've very kindly talked for an hour and 45 minutes, so probably, unless there's anything else you'd like to say.
You're satisfied?
More than satisfied.
Okay.
Very happy. Thank you very much indeed, Robert.
My pleasure.
Robert, you've done many pieces of research in your life, and obviously had a very enjoyable and exciting time. Tell me about one or two of the crowning journeys you've made into the strange world that you inhabit.
I won't promise to limit it to one or two.
Well, as many as you like.
Well, my first bit of luck, I think, was to get into the early days of ethology, at any rate ethology in this country. Ethology was a new way of studying animal behaviour, which was started by really by Lawrence and Tinbergen, though they had very different views on it. But from my point of view, it had several special characteristics. It insisted that you must always start with description. And the description must be the basis of any understanding of natural phenomena. Second, that you must study the behavior of animals in their natural environment, not in an artificial laboratory one. And third, that you must ask 4 questions, which I can best illustrate in this case by asking, why do we have one finger that's different from the others? And you can make a causal answer, say the nerves and muscles are connected up differently. You can give a developmental answer, that the thumb developed differently from the rest. You can give a functional answer, it's easier to grasp with, and you can give an evolutionary answer. We came from monkey-like ancestors, and they have prehensile thumbs. So that you don't really understand a bit of behaviour until you've answered those 4 questions. And this came into collision with a group in the American Museum of Natural History at that time, led by Schneerla.
How does he spell his name?
Schneirla. And he had a pupil called Daniel Lehrman, who wrote a vicious attack on ethology. It was watered down slightly by some people, but still it was a very, very strong attack. And we tended to picture Danny Lehrman as a great ogre until he came across to Europe and talked with us, and he turned out to be an absolutely charming man who was grossly overweight and a passionate bird watcher, and all he cared about was bird watching. And he became about my closest friend. We used to see each other one side or the other of the Atlantic every year, at least once a year, until he died in, I think it was 1971. And eventually it led to some sort of rapprochement between comparative psychology as studied in the States and ethology as studied in this country. I mentioned the 4 whys, but one of the things I regret is that I paid too little attention to the functional why, which has become the centre of behaviour studies in recent years, largely due to the work of W.D. Hamilton. And that was a mistake that I made quite early on. But it was very exciting to do the comparative studies of, I did comparative studies of the courtship of finches, for instance, and to be able to argue from that how the displays evolved and what the relations between the different species were. Then, moving into mother-child relations, I've already talked about that, I think. But that was a very exciting time, and it was exciting for me because I felt I was doing something that might make a real difference in the world. And it was exciting in another way because it gave me a chance to get into the primate field work. I was the only person who knew about non-human primates in this country at that time. So I got to, I think I mentioned this before, I got to supervise Jane Goodall, Diane Fossey, and lots of students who went through their camps. And that was a really exciting time. Primate field work was relatively new. There'd been 1 or 2 people who'd done studies in the 30s, but very few. And Jane Goodall was really breaking new ground. And my role with her was to teach her precise recordings, how to record behaviour in the field, which I sort of learned by studying captive monkeys. And she taught me so much about individual differences in animals and how personality mattered. And much the same goes for Diane. And there were a long string of students who went through those camps, and I used to go and supervise them in the summertime. Then I got involved in preschool behaviour, and that reflected back on my relationship with John Bowlby. My wife followed his work more closely than I did, and as a result did much more interesting work, I think. But it was an exciting time for me, and watching preschool children was such a lovely age to watch and work with, that I really enjoyed that period of my life. And then that led me on to studying personal relationships. That again, I thought I was doing something important now, because there was no science of human relationships, only studies of human interactions, short-term interactions. And we were really felt as though we were starting a new branch of science. And it is indeed now, I won't say I was the first, but I was one of the first. It's now a flourishing branch of psychology with several journals devoted specifically to it and so on. And what I tried to do, not wholly successfully, was to set up a scientific framework based on observation and then analysis for studying all the complexities of human relationships.
The great popularizer, of course, of this was Desmond Morris. What did you think of his work? Man watching and all this sort of stuff.
Now you've put me on the spot, haven't you? Desmond was an extremely clever man who was a student of Nico Tinbergen, I think just after I was in Oxford. Very talented, took to photography, drew beautifully and all that. And he wrote a book called The Naked Ape, effectively saying that men were just like chimpanzees, not quite as crudely as them. And I parted company with him at that point because it was very difficult to make ethology, animal behaviour studies, sound respectable and scientific. And I thought he was detracting from the image of ethology and doing it a great deal of harm. Nico Tinbergen, we disagreed on this, and he thought that Desmond was awakening a lot of people's interests in ethology, and that he should be encouraged. I just didn't take that view, but there it is. And he never really worked on relationships. He I don't want to say any more about that. Okay?
Okay.
But after working on human relationships, I then worked on religion and morality, as I think I said previously. What's remarkable in a sense about this is that I've never had to take any decisions in my life. I think I mentioned that I had the choice between being a BOAC pilot and being an undergraduate. That was a decision taken not very rationally, but rather because I was a bit afraid of my tutor, I think. Then at one point I had a decision whether to apply for a lectureship or a demonstratorship in psychology, which I decided to apply, and thank God didn't get it. And that was one of the best things that ever happened to me. And the only other decision I've had to take was whether to let my name go forward as Biological Secretary of the Royal Society. And I decided against that because I didn't want to get tied up in that detailed administration. I wanted to go on with my research. But that's been so wonderful of having a Royal Society research professorship, that I could move through these different phases in my life, follow these different projects. I think scoop some of the cream off them, and then move on when I felt like it. and something else beckoned. The other thing I want to say is how lucky I've been with my mentors. First of all, David Lack, who was officially my research supervisor, let me do what I wanted to do, and he didn't interfere. He wasn't much help, but he didn't interfere. Nico Tinbergen came to Oxford when I was there. We had long walks together. We started to write a book together, I think I said that, but he had to drop out because he wasn't well and was too busy. But he has been the main inspiration of most of my work. Bill Thorpe, who gave me the job at Madingley, again let me do what I wanted to do. I only realised years later that he wanted me to work on birdsong, and I tried to do that, but Peter Marler took it up and did much better than I'm sure I could have done. Then in the 50s I came across Gabriel Horn. I can't remember exactly how, and we edited a book together called Short-Term Changes in Neural Activity and Behaviour. I think we met through a seminar organised by Thorpe and Zangwill, who was Professor of Psychology, which was an effort to break the interdisciplinary boundaries. Anyway, Gabriel and I did this book together, and that was very educative for me, and we had a nice time because we ran a conference, and one of the Dutch participants gave us a bottle of Genève, and we used to drink this bottle of Genève as we edited the manuscripts.
Can you say anything more about Gabriel, because he is going to be he is the subject of one of our interviews, and well, he's a neighbour of mine, so fellow of King's. And
Gabriel and Danny Lerman, who died, and Jay Rosenblatt, who was another American at the American Museum of Natural History, have been my three closest male friends. And Gabriel remains so, and he's become a family friend, and he's godfather to one of my daughters, and we try and have dinner together whenever either he and Prill or I and Joan have a birthday. We don't always manage it because Gabriel always says he's too busy. But, he's a busy man.
Yes, yes.
But that's fine. Mm-hmm. And I'm very fond of Gabriel. And then I was lucky, my second marriage, married Joan Stevenson, because she's also a psychologist. She brought a new perspective to my work, and we did work together that led to her doing very important work, I think, on attachments, John Bowlby's attachment theory. Then there are certain Americans who were very kind to me. Frank Beach, who was professor of, I suppose, psychology at New Haven when I first met him. He was a wonderful man, very charismatic, very good with students, very kind to young people, as he was with me, tending to be an alcoholic, which was a tragedy, but always tremendous fun, and always telling dirty stories. I remember him introducing me when I was giving a lecture in Berkeley. He went to Berkeley eventually. And he said, "You all know Robert Hinde. I'm not going to introduce him. I'm going to tell you a dirty story." And he did. And that was Frank Beach. I was very sorry when he died. Another, more briefly, was Ernst Mayr, who I came across a certain amount. And
how do you spell the name?
M-A-Y-R. And he's a very famous biologist, and we did a paper together on the systematische Stellung der Gattung Fringilla, on the systematic position of the genus that the chaffinch belongs to. Danny Lerman, I've already said, and I won't say more about him, but both he and Jay Rosenblatt who were ex-servicemen. They both went to the Department of Animal Behaviour in the American Museum. Neither of them could make up their minds whether to become psychoanalysts or not. Jay did, and Danny didn't. So Jay has spent the rest of his life until he retired being an analyst before breakfast and doing animal behaviour work during the rest of the day. I once asked him which he enjoyed most, and he said, oh, the animal behaviour work, because there you can be really yourself, whereas with an analyst, being an analyst, whether he was a good analyst, I really don't know, but with an analyst you're never fully yourself because you always have to be, as it were, taking in the patient. The last thing I want to say is that quite apart from these mentors or friends, I've had the most wonderful students, and I've always maintained that one learns more from one's graduate students than you ever teach them. But it started off with Pat Bateson, who became a close friend, but he was not quite my first, but almost my first graduate student, and he took up the study of imprinting, and we became friends. And there was a long period when he was director of the Sub-Department of Animal Behaviour in Madingley, and I was director of a Medical Research Council unit on the development and integration of behaviour within that sub-department, which which was actually larger, I think, than the sub-department itself. And we had a very good relationship. We used to run the joint together, and I was very lucky to have this MRC unit, which again allowed me money and to do what I wanted to do. And the name, Development and Integration of Behaviour, I chose because I couldn't conceive of anything that I could ever possibly want to do that didn't come within that rubric. Then I've mentioned already Jane Goodall and Diane Fossey. It was wonderful to work with them. Two very remarkable women. I wish if Diane Fossey hadn't died, she'd have gone on to do wonderful work. They both got more interested in conservation than in science, and in Jane Goodall's case, education as well. And that's a good thing, and if I was very happy with that, and Jane's done wonderful things in the rest of her life. Peter Marler and John Crook were both students at Madingley. They were both officially students of Bill Thorpe's, though I supervised Peter Marler for a while.
Is that him as in the composer?
Hmm?
Marler as in the composer? M-A-H?
No, M-A-R-L-E-R.
Mm-hmm.
And John Crook, C-R-O-O-K. John Crook is a very much underrated man because he really made a breakthrough in behavioural ecology, and a lot of people say behavioural ecology really started with him. He did a comparative study of weaver birds and showed the relation between their life history, their nesting habits, and the habitat and so on. He went to Bristol as a lecturer and then got more interested in Zen, and he had a cottage in Wales where he used to sit and look at the wall and all that sort of thing, which wasn't quite my cup of tea. And I very much regret he didn't go on in biology. Then more recently there have been some remarkable students of non-human primates. I'd like to mention especially Richard Wrangham, who's now a professor at Harvard, Dorothy and Robert Seyfarth, who are at University of Pennsylvania.
How do you spell that name? Seyfarth?
S-E-Y-F-A-R-T-H.
Yeah.
And Sandy Harcourt and Kelly Stewart, who had studied gorilla and have gone on to do other very interesting work since. And they started off on Diane Fossey's camp, studying gorilla The last thing I want to say, and it's something I sometimes ask myself, do I have any regrets about my academic career? And I do sometimes feel that I spent an awful lot of time doing things that were tremendous fun, but were they really doing any good to the human race? And studying comparative study of canary courtship and finch courtship, or canary nest building, much of the stuff I did in the early days, I don't see that the human race is really all that much better for it, though I sometimes kid myself that any advance in science is worthwhile. But it's for that reason that I've turned more and more in the last 20, 30 years towards studies of aggression and war and how to stop it, and religion and ethics, which I still sometimes try and kid myself that is some use. And I'm very lucky to have got involved in Pugwash, because Pugwash is an organisation which I mentioned last time. It's an organisation primarily of scientists, which, by maintaining an impeccable scientific reputation, is able to influence government. And that sort of meets everything I want to do. Thank you.
I just had one question, one last question. If you supervise many PhD students, and when they come to you and say they want to do research, or a hypothetical future researcher, what would you give? Would you have any advice, particular advice on how to do interesting and enjoyable research?
I always have said to them, you've got to do something that you passionately want to find out about. It's no good my setting you a problem, a particular problem. Of course they all came to me because they wanted to work in the sort of area that I was working in at the time. But it's no good my giving you a problem. This is what happened to me. I went to David Lack, and he wanted me to work on the comparative behaviour of corvids. And I said, no, I don't want to do that. I want to do a behaviour study. And he let me. And I've always done that with students. And Pat Bateson was a bit of an exception in that I'd started some work on imprinting. He took it up and did it much better, and I gave it up at that point. But and he invented much better techniques than I was using, and so on. But I always think that they should choose their subject within limits, and it must be something they passionately want to find out about, because there is nothing more dreary than doing research. The mechanics of doing research can be painstakingly boring, and I always used to warn them of that. I spent, I suppose, 5 or 6 winters on my knees in a cold, drafty wooden bird room, recording how often a chaffinch chinked when I put an owl in front of it. I mean, it's that sort of thing that is very tedious, and I think they had to recognise that before they started. Otherwise, I did try and, with field workers, I did try and give them good preparation before they went out into the field, and most of them practiced recording techniques with our captive monkeys and that sort of thing.
Good. Well, thank you very much indeed.